thank you so much, and thank you for the pleasure and honor of presenting here at this very important event. I've learned a great deal about Freemasonry, about fraternalism. In fact, the topic for this conference is not specifically Freemasonry, but it is a world conference on fraternalism, social capital, and civil society. My perspective on these, and although many of the talks have been very specifically on Freemasonry and its history, which has been very useful to me because this is an entirely new topic for me, and writing this paper was very useful for me to more develop a fuller understanding of Freemasonry. My usual topic at conferences would be globalization, international relations, maybe comparative law, often comparing Anglophone or English common law with the civilian or continental law. But if you look at the modern development of either continental or Anglophone law, it would be impossible to separate out Freemasonry from those legal developments. So you can't say interrelated, you would have to say they're assimilated to one another. When we talk about fraternalism as a general topic, I begin my paper with the Cluniac Fellowship, which was very important, founded in 910 AD, and was sort of historically set the precedent for future brotherhoods connected among themselves by the oath. And this is the beginning of the tradition of professed brotherhoods, fraternities in the West, or let's say the relevant beginning. My approach to this topic is neither pro nor con, in favor of or against. I just try to provide a little different way of thinking about this topic, which includes specifically the topic of Freemasonry. As this relates to the global age, I think this becomes a very important topic once again, because I think we're seeing a resurgence of Masonry because probably it answers to some of the needs in our kind of global culture, global society at this time, the attributes that it attempts to instill, the lessons it attempts to teach, the tenets upon which it's founded, I think fill a need among men and women. When I discuss these developments in this paper, I talk about men and fraternities, even though in our age, women are often included in these professional groups or professed groups. It's easy, and for my purposes, more convenient to just refer to them as fraternal organizations. I'll begin by just reading. My paper is much too long to fit within this time period, and maybe your stamina in listening. So I will begin by reading one section, and then I will just summarize the following section, and we'll see how it develops. Title of my paper is Fraternal Oath and Global Governance: How a Medieval Practice Has Survived into the 21st Century Rule of Law. There are many ways to understand the project of globalization. It is often portrayed in terms of technology and communication, relations of finance and trade, or as a matter of demographics and disparity. These are, of course, important elements, but fundamentally, no aspect of this great work is more important than the legal basis upon which a new global order is being constructed. Viewed from that perspective, it also entails the important question of whether or in what way the two historic traditions of Western law, Anglophone and civilian, will provide its authoritative basis. When considering these two traditions of law, however, there are also questions of whether they might converge to undertake the task, whether they might assimilate to one another, have separate and parallel roles, or whether one tradition might become completely dominant. Proponents of convergence look to end centuries of unfriendly rivalry between these two systems of law, hoping to combine the pragmatic adaptability of the English tradition with the principled predictability of civil law. Others are pessimistic and assert that the two are inherently contradictory in nature, and that either one or the other must come to predominate. In such discussions, the question is often raised in an impersonal realm of abstractions and ideals, involving institutions and procedures, states and corporations. The universal civilian tradition, long based on principle and reason and tied to the mechanism of the territorial state, is thought to be weakened by technical advances that make old geographic and linguistic barriers irrelevant. By contrast, a transcendent Anglophone tradition based on consensus and faith, pragmatic in its approach and elevated above the state, seems naturally adapted to the mechanism of the supranational corporation and seems to be thriving, its influence expanding around the 21st century world. Despite the importance of these matters, and despite the insight put forth in these discussions, however, there are other ways of thinking about the global project and the legal method by which an all-inclusive order will be constructed. That is, to view this topic not only as one of technology, institutions, and concepts, but also as a matter of human action and volition. Actually, most people in most parts of the world, in most of human history, and much of the human present, including, for example, people in the Islamic and Asian traditions, have understood these questions in personal terms. They have viewed the process of rule as essentially comprising the power and authority of a man or an established small group of men presiding over the affairs of a multitude of men. So their way of thinking about law or order or harmony in society is not abstract and institutional, it's personal and human. In fact, for much of the development of Western law, both Anglophone and civilian, these traditions have been established in groups of men bound together in common purpose. Whether at Bologna in the 12th century, this is where our civilian tradition of law began at the University of Bologna, or in London during the same period with the very famous Inns of Court being founded at the same time. The university in one city and the guilds of trade in the other, men were joined together to provide the human basis upon which both laws were founded. Over generations and centuries, both of these traditions, whether engaging the work as part of a Christian order of worldly affairs, or simply as a monopoly of commercial trade and service to the king, the method in both forms of legal rule was based in a fellowship whose members were joined together by fraternal oath, and that approached its work as a collective of members with a single unified purpose. Even though in the 21st century a pronounced American influence has come to prevail in the modernized version of these two strands of legal authority, it is still useful to understand their simultaneous origins and their parallel development into the global age as examples of medievalism and fraternal rule based on personal oath and brotherly discipline. Viewed in such a way, it is not surprising that the debate concerning whether the two traditions will converge or which of the two will predominate, along with continuing debates over the relative importance of the nation-state and the corporation, still takes place almost wholly within the cloisters of various professional fellowships that carry on this tradition as they work to construct a global rule of law. So even today, the real conversation about constructing a global order is not a public discussion. It takes place within professional bodies. And these contemporary professional bodies that we have today are very much the descendants of those medieval origins. This next section I'm not going to read, I'm just going to discuss a little bit about the beginnings of these two traditions of law. Bologna 1088, very famously, was the first university founded in Europe, and from Bologna developed the University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. Bologna was the center for the study of the famous Justinian codes from the late Roman Empire. The founding of the University of Bologna followed on one of the great turning points in Western history, which is called the Gregorian Reform. Around 1070, Pope Gregory VII, who was a member of the important Cluniac order, was the first pope to collect authority for both the educative and adjudicative mechanisms of governance in all of Christendom. The Cluniac order, founded in Cluny, France, you might have visited there, was founded in 910, was much more important, in fact, with its great cathedral, much more important than Rome. The bishop there, much more important than the Papa or the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And it was the first liturgical fellowship that had transcendent influence in both the sacred and secular aspects of life. So it was kind of the progenitor, kind of the forerunner of all of those very famous followers, the Knights Templar, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and even the Masonic Lodge follow on this kind of pattern. Pope Gregory VII, in a very famous encounter with Emperor Henry IV, I think in 1076 at Canossa, Italy, the Emperor of the West, of the Latin West, knelt down and submitted to the Pope. This is the real beginning of the rise of papal rule. Once again, I'm not commenting for or against. It was just the fact. This change in legal and religious authority caused a great interest in law. And that was the reason that Bologna became such an important center, because the Italians were very advanced in the study of law. Another development coming out of this great Gregorian Reform and the legal revolution taking place was the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror was supported by the papacy. It was a catastrophic event for the natives of the British Isles, but it established a new kind of centralized Norman kingship. In theory, England was under this new law that was being promulgated from Bologna, but very soon there was a dispute between the Norman kings and the legal scholars who had been trained at Bologna. So the royal courts in London were turned over to a guild of practitioners who were loyal to the king and who were given a monopoly of trade to operate the royal courts of justice for fees and gratuities. This is the beginning of what came to be called the common law. So they're very different types of law, very different ways of doing law, and very different conceptions of the purpose of law. When we think about this period, also, it's important to remember that this kind of legal strata of practitioner, whether they were ecclesiastical or secular lawyers being trained in Bologna or in the Inns of Court in London, was a very small group of men. Above them and below them were, of course, the nobility and the commoners or the peasants. The men who were at the university or at the Inns of Court were joined together as fraternal brothers with a pledge. They were professed, as they say. That was the basis of their organization. But those above, the great, much more numerous nobility and peasantry, were joined together by inheritance and by descent, through familial descent, the strongest bond in nature. This is important to remember. Okay, beginning with number 3, I'm going to resume reading here for just a moment. However, along with the nobility, the ecclesia, and the peasantry, another faction in Latin Christendom had also begun to flourish in the 11th and 12th century. This was a network of urban settlements, towns, burgs, or communes, established as centers of long-distance finance and trade. Differing from the local village or the ecclesiastical city, the town had come into being primarily as an appendage of the Italian centers of opulence and wealth, most notably the city of Venice. Compared to the Eastern Mediterranean, Latin Europe was looked upon as a rustic backwater of poverty and ignorance, sustained by a rudimentary agriculture. Venice, a commercial outpost of the imperial metropolis Constantinople, was the exception. From the emerging centers of Italian wealth, first Venice, then Florence and Genoa, a network of towns grew independently of both church and empire. As lines of trade extended northward, invitations from local lords or princes would offer inducements of permanent settlement and monopolies of trade. The presence of a town meant a flow of wealth and taxable income to the local realm. Over time, the financial power of the merchants and bankers grew. They came to be granted special charters, constituting them as highly autonomous estates, with a rank of privilege just below the nobility. From time to time, members of such an estate would meet to consult or parley with the king, the high ecclesia, and the nobility. This was the beginning of what we now call parliaments. The operation of the town rested on a unity of interests, a mingling of wealth, the commercial ties among the town fathers, the elders, the aldermen, or burghers. Municipal affairs were presided over by the mayor, or major, or meister, who acted on behalf of the town council. But the accumulated wealth of the townsmen was dependent directly on their close association with trading partners across the continent. This made them inherently cosmopolitan in their outlook. In effect, such a town operated as a guild of trade, a legally independent island governing its own population in an otherwise broad ecclesiastical, manorial, and agricultural landscape. Its business practices were often in conflict with the nobility and at odds with the teachings of the church, especially in matters of usury and price. Alongside this growing commercial power was a parallel increase in the influence of advocates and jurists who had come to be essential to the operation of church and empire, kingdom and diocese. In the 15th century, the interests of the legal nations and the town burghers or bourgeoisie converged. That discovery of mutual interest coincided with the onset of technical and scientific advance occurring across Christendom. The result was a dramatic change beginning around 1500. It brought the first technological turning point in 2,000 years, but also it eventually made possible the establishment of a new way of life based upon advancing technical foundation. What came to be called the three great inventions would transform Christendom. They were the maritime compass, brought world exploration and an influx of wealth to commercial centers. Gunpowder weapons brought a new kind of total war, as well as a decline of the old knightly class. Finally, the printing press and the ability to publish books brought widespread literacy and divergences of belief. The advent of movable type also brought law codes, Bibles, and publications in the many national vernaculars. Most of all, the new innovations provided the means for dramatic change and a joining of interests between the townsmen and the legal caste. The overthrow of the old ecclesia and empire seemed almost inevitable. A century of civil and religious conflict ensued. The once unified Latin domain was divided into independent and sovereign kingdoms, republics, commonwealths. Ultimately, these came to be presided over by the newly ascendant combination of wealth, law, and religion, until the tumult and carnage finally ended on the continent with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. A once united empire and church was divided into territorial polities. The point of civil law development, the high point of civil law development, the birth of the nation state. In England, the upheaval resolved itself somewhat differently during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Dutch stadtholder William III, followed by an armada of merchants and bankers, arrived in London where he ascended the throne. The result was a famously unwritten constitution presided over by newly enriched hereditary and gentry classes. In fact, on both sides of the English Channel, there was a new order of existence in which the oath of office and the pledge of loyalty, not hereditary descent, provided the basic fulcrum of rule. How am I doing on time? Oh, I haven't yet got to the Masons. Okay. Yeah, Okay, thank you for telling me. It's impossible to know the origins, probably impossible to know the origin of the Masonic Lodge. But when this dramatic change in the social, political, legal structure of Latin Christendom occurred, it left a vacuum. The old nobility was wiped out, let's say, its importance, and the place of the commoners, the peasants, was disrupted. So those two anchors of inheritance and descent more or less disintegrated. But the fellowships founded on the pledge was not yet perfected in its organization. This is the period that Habermas describes as one with many of the coffee houses and academies founded in France and England, where this new kind of middle class was rising to importance, but it had no mechanism by which not only to govern within the state was not yet solidified, but also on an international level to maintain peace between the various new polities. In this vacuum, there was a tremendous need, and Freemasonry was the most important form that coalesced to meet this need. This is really an abbreviated version of the history of the entire world. The point of my paper is, in the global age, we have a great deal of, let's say, societal confusion, a kind of disintegration of traditional cultures, a real fundamental questioning of what government is, what it should be, what kind of world we should live in. It's highly probable that Freemasonry, with its different kind of obedience and attachment, the tenets on which it's based, the kind of lessons it attempts to instill in its membership, can answer to this kind of need in our world today. And hopefully, as a convinced Francophile, the French will have some influence in this also. That's my talk. Thank you.
Joseph, thank you for the wonderful talk, and we're looking forward to reading your text in its entirety. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone to join us into the grand auditorium for the closing remarks and ceremonies, and also for a toast. Thank you.